15 minutes. News now on BBC One with Peter Sissons at just after 9 minutes to 10.
Israel, a nation in shock, grieves for its murdered leader Yitzhak Rabin. Hundreds of thousands have been queuing to pay a final tribute to the man who said he was ready to take risks for peace. And political leaders west and east are making their way to the funeral as they assess the impact of his loss. Good evening. The people of Israel, who've never before lost a head of government to an assassin's gun, are tonight queuing silently in their tens of thousands to say farewell to Yitzhak Rabin. He was shot dead just over 24 hours ago by a Jewish extremist shortly after addressing a peace rally. And the death of one of Israel's greatest war heroes, whose peacemaking with the Palestinians split the nation, has left Israel stunned and uncertain. His funeral will take place tomorrow in Jerusalem. So far, 42 heads of state and government have said they'll be there.
By mid-afternoon, tens of thousands of people had already filed through the garden of the Knesset, Israel's parliament, past the coffin of their dead prime minister. The police are expecting 1 million, a fifth of the population, to pay their respects before Mr. Rabin's funeral tomorrow. There's been an explosion of grief. In the last few months, there's been a lot of easy speculation here about Jew killing Jew. Now they've seen what that really means, and it scares them. Earlier, supported by her family, Mrs. Leah Rabin led the mourners as her husband's coffin was laid out at the Knesset. Yitzhak Rabin's son said the Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead. The caretaker government was represented by Shimon Peres, who became acting prime minister when Mr. Rabin died of his wounds. Last night had seemed so promising. 100,000 people had gathered in Tel Aviv to demonstrate for peace in support of Mr. Rabin. He seemed well satisfied. A few minutes before he was shot, his wife kissed the organizers of the rally and they set out for home. Mr. Rabin was hit as he reached his car. A bodyguard was wounded when he threw himself on the gun. The police hustled the assassin away. Later he told them that his orders came from God and that he had no regrets because Mr. Rabin's pursuit of peace made him a traitor to his people. He said he'd planned to kill Mr. Peres as well. The man has been named as Yigal Amir, a known Jewish extremist. Earlier this year, police dragged him from an illegal demonstration in the occupied West Bank against concessions to the Palestinians. In the early hours of this morning, Shimon Peres convened the cabinet. Every face showed their horror and the daunting scale of the job they'd been left to finish. Mr. Peres said his old colleague had been delighted by the turnout at the peace rally.
Never did I see him more happy, more excited, more complete with himself.
For the time being, there's a political truce.
I think we have to exercise today a great deal of restraint and coolness of judgment, and above all, bring the people together to heal this terrible wound.
A few subdued workmen were cleaning up after the peace rally in Tel Aviv this morning. Israelis fear their politicians will forget the calls for national reconciliation once the shock of the assassination recedes. The Labour-led coalition under Mr. Peres might try to channel all this by calling a snap election. Grief and nostalgia for Mr. Rabin might give them another 4 years in power, another 4 years to negotiate with the Palestinians. In Jerusalem tonight, tens of thousands of Israelis are still at the Knesset. They're clinging to the hope that Mr. Rabin did enough to make the peace process irreversible.
I believe that the only way is to go ahead and to keep on with what Rabin said. There is only the peace that can bring us back together to have a future for those kids.
But nobody here is very sure anymore.
This crisis is as serious as any Israel has faced since independence. Israelis have started to realize just how divided they are. Many of the people here tonight are scared because they've lost the man who had the best chance of recreating a little unity and perhaps even delivering a real peace.
They may still get that, but the assassination has added a new set of doubts to all the old ones. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News, Jerusalem.
As he left for Israel today, John Major said Mr. Rabin gave his life for peace. He joined the call by other world leaders for the Middle East peace process to continue unabated as a tribute to Yitzhak Rabin. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Tom Carver reports.
With this handshake on the White House lawn, Yitzhak Rabin launched Israel's peace process. He knew the risks he was taking by talking to his enemies, but he believed that it was his country's only chance of survival.
Enough of blood and tears. Enough!
Tonight, as he prepared to leave for Israel, President Clinton said that he had lost a close friend. Ironically, Yitzhak Rabin's violent death may well help to reconcile Israel with its Arab neighbours. Both King Hussein of Jordan and Egypt's Hosni Mubarak will attend the funeral in Israeli-occupied Jerusalem. Yasser Arafat has decided to stay away, though he was clearly shaken by what had happened. The Prime Minister paid his tribute before leaving for Israel, accompanied by Tony Blair and Paddy Ashdown.
I found him a man utterly determined to proceed down the peace process, despite the short-term difficulties, despite the obvious discomforts of going down that road politically, because he believed there was a great historical opportunity for peace, and he was determined to try and take it.
But in the Palestinian camps of southern Lebanon, news of Yitzhak Rabin's murder was celebrated with the ominous sound of gunfire. When extremists like these rejoice, the rest of the Middle East has cause to worry. Yitzhak Rabin and his peace process were hated by both ends of the ethnic spectrum here. Israeli right-wingers regarded the process as an act of treachery. Their attack on a Palestinian mosque last year proved they meant business. But up to now, no one believed they were capable of assassinating their own Prime Minister. For Yitzhak Rabin, switching from the role of general, the hero of the Six-Day War, to a man of peace took considerable courage. He lived long enough to witness the first stage. In May last year, the Gaza Strip and the city of Jericho were handed over to Palestinian control. This was followed a year later by Israeli troop withdrawals from a further 7 cities on the occupied West Bank. But there is nothing permanent about this process. Whether it can continue without the dominating figure of Rabin must be open to doubt. Even his most loyal supporters admit that his successor, Shimon Peres, lacks Rabin's charisma. Next year, Israel is due to go to the polls. With Rabin now out of the way, the right wing could well seize power. If that happens, the peace process is unlikely to survive. Tom Carver, BBC News.
Well, I'm joined now from Jerusalem by our diplomatic correspondent Brian Hanrahan. Brian, Mr. Peres will not want a damaging political vacuum. What do you think is going through his mind even now?
Well, there's a lot of talk about a snap election, but the trouble with that is that there is no such thing as a snap election in Israel. It takes about 3 months to organise, and 3 months in the current volatile atmosphere, almost anything could happen. The other alternative is to soldier on, effectively to stick with Mr. Rabin's policy beyond the grave, keep the balances in place, and implement the peace plan, and hope that the security benefits will start to show through. If he goes for a snap election, he becomes a caretaker government. Effectively, he can't take any further decisions, and that freezes things as they are, with the peace plan only halfway implemented.
At this crossroads in Israel's history, would it be a delusion to expect the extremists who may feel they've looked into the abyss to soften their line?
Well, I spoke to one leader today from the right wing who, while trying to put a great deal of space between himself and any suggestive violence, was in no mood to compromise. He said that the issues that were at stake here were the survival of Israel. He was utterly opposed to giving back territory, and he would continue to be so. I mean, what this is going to be fought out on eventually in an election is not with the extremists. It's going to be fought out in the centre. What's happened is that over the last year or so, the centre has got worried about what's going on in Israel and has swung away to the right, got doubtful about the peace plan. This event may swing them back. On the other hand, it may scare them into going off towards people who don't want to change the status quo. It's a very, very uncertain time.
Brian Hanrahan, thank you. And now the rest of today's news. A Conservative MP has denied any impropriety was involved in trying to arrange a meeting between a businessman and a government minister in return for cash. One Sunday newspaper reported that Barry Porter agreed to be paid a fee, but Mr. Porter said he didn't actually accept any money. These latest allegations come on the eve of the Commons vote on MPs' outside business interests, which the government may lose.
So-called sleaze has hit the newsstands a day ahead of schedule, with the Sunday Times saying the Conservative Barry Porter agreed 14 months ago to put a business in touch with ministers for a fee. His response, that kind of thing wasn't unusual before Nolan came along, and no money changed hands anyway.
It was a commercial proposition. It wasn't asking me to do something which I wouldn't have declared, and I've always declared in the Register of Members' Interests.
It's another item for Tory MPs to dwell on as tomorrow's debate approaches. Sir Alan Hazelhurst is backing the Prime Minister. Yes to a ban on MPs being paid for actively pursuing their clients' interests in the Commons, but no to the publication of payments just for advice.
How far does public curiosity go, and how far does it need to go? The real test is whether members of Parliament are judged by their constituents to be doing a proper job for them.
Naturally, Labour hope that Sir Alan, MP for Saffron Walden, and all like-minded Tories will be punished by their constituents. This may not be the biggest ever billboard campaign, but it made their point for them. Meanwhile, this Tory, distinctly uncomfortable at the idea of voting with Labour, is planning to introduce a compromise amendment tomorrow. Failing that,
listening to the public, listening to my constituents, I'm clear in my mind that we have no choice. If we want to restore the public's faith in Parliament, we have to disclose relevant earnings. I wish we didn't, but we have to pay that price.
And both sides say amendments that are being spoken of as possible compromises will not command enough support to make a difference, which leaves the vote looking finely balanced. Jeremy Vine, BBC News, Westminster.
Tomorrow's special cabinet meeting on next year's public spending round has been cancelled after ministers came to an agreement on all outstanding issues. It's believed to have been one of the toughest spending rounds for years, with all government departments having to cut running costs by as much as 5% of their budgets. Parkhurst Prison, home to some of the country's most dangerous criminals, has launched an urgent inquiry into how inmates obtained 2 of its main security keys. Warders on a routine search discovered the impression of the 2 keys hidden in the pastry of a pie. Once turned into keys, it's thought they could have opened a substantial number of doors at the prison. Earlier this year, 3 prisoners serving life sentences escaped from Parkhurst. Abroad, the former Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti is to stand trial in connection with the murder of a journalist 16 years ago. It's alleged that Mr. Andreotti, who's already on trial in Sicily for collusion with the mafia, conspired with them to kill a magazine editor to stop him publishing damaging material. He denies the charge. In Poland's presidential election, early results indicate that Lech Wałęsa and his main rival, the former communist minister Aleksander Kwaśniewski, are neck and neck. And it looks certain that there'll be a second ballot in a fortnight because no candidate got an outright majority.
Written off as a no-hoper earlier this year, Lech Wałęsa's fighting spirit and instinct for survival appear to have brought him back to within grasp of another 5 years as president. His tactic has been to evoke the past and portray himself as the only man who can stop the former communist. But Aleksander Kwaśniewski says he's now a committed social democrat and, like Mr. Wałęsa, supports the market economy and Poland's aspirations to join NATO and the European Union. The church, though, still influential in Poland and still suspicious of former communists, isn't convinced. And voters who came out of Mass today and went straight to their polling stations were well aware of the Catholic hierarchy's opposition to Mr. Kwaśniewski. The first exit poll predictions suggested the 2 main candidates were running neck and neck, each having attracted about 1/3 of the vote and both well clear of the field. In the Wałęsa camp, cheers of joy and relief. The belief here is that the man from Gdansk is now unbeatable. Having recovered from dismal popularity ratings 6 months ago, Lech Wałęsa now seems safely through to the second round of voting in a fortnight. Then he'll be hoping for a decisive surge of new support from voters who didn't back him today, but who nevertheless don't want a former communist as president. Steve McCormack, BBC News, Warsaw.
Here, the former Welsh captain Jonathan Davies has made his return to rugby union after an absence of 7 years. Playing for Cardiff against Aberavon, he showed much of the pace and strength he had before he returned to rugby league. He now hopes to return to the national side in time for the 5 Nations Championship next year. And the main news again. Thousands of Israelis are tonight paying their respects to Yitzhak Rabin, whose body is lying in state following his assassination yesterday. We'll be bringing you live coverage on BBC One of the state funeral starting at 10 to 12 tomorrow morning. But that's all from the BBC Newsroom tonight. Good night.
Good evening to you. Well, a fine sunny day across many parts of England and Wales after, of course, a very chilly start. It's going to be a chilly night again tonight under this area of high pressure. It's only slipping away slowly southeast. Quite different, though, up to the north and the west. This area of cloud here from that front, that's brought some spells of rain. This front also moving eastwards will bring some spells of rain during tomorrow. The satellite picture already shows that cloud up in those north and western areas, but this cloud further east is quite thin, so it's not preventing the temperature falling at all. We've already got some frost in central and eastern areas, and temperatures tonight about -3, -4 in the Midlands across towards East Anglia, but quite different up to the north. Here quite mild, the stiff southerly wind and the cloud keeping temperatures about 6 or 7 across Northern Ireland and Western Scotland. There the day starts cloudy with some spells of rain. That rain pushing eastwards across many parts of Scotland through the morning. Some fairly heavy rain too across some of the higher areas. That getting into northwest England and perhaps North Wales in the early afternoon. Further southeast, still a good deal of sunshine, but some cloud pushing slowly southeast. Despite the sunshine though, temperatures across eastern England at the lowest about 9 degrees. Up in the northwest, where it's cloudy and damp right through the day, the southwesterly wind bringing mild air temperatures about 13. Now on Monday night, still a touch of frost in some southeastern areas, but much up to the north and the west, dry and mild. That's it from me. Good night.
For 200 years, this West Virginia hotel has been America's most prestigious resort. But in tunnels underneath lies one of the best-kept secrets of the Cold War. A nuclear bunker from which Congress would govern the United States in World War III.
We must be ready every day. Duck and cover.
The Secrets of the Bunker on Breakfast News, tomorrow from 7 on BBC One.
A matter of taste.
Really? Salt! I mean, do you have any idea of how many highly skilled man-hours over a 3-day period have gone into producing this dish? And without tasting it, you call for salt?
Your salt, sir. Lenny Henry spices things up.
I hate you with a passion you can only dream of.
Chef, tomorrow, 10 past 10 on BBC One.
Bon appetit.